Well, let's start with Zion Williamson, the most exciting prospect to come out of college in a very long time. What do you think he's going to mean for the NBA?
I don't want to add to the already tremendous pressure on Zion. I had an opportunity to spend some time with him out at the draft lottery and his mom and stepdad, and he seems like an incredible young man. I'm also a Duke graduate, so I have a little special fondness for him, but I'm excited for him to come into the league. But again, I mean, think about it, at that age, only one college season behind him. It looks like a strong class, but I don't want to put any more pressure on him. But I'm looking forward to seeing him in the league.
You know, one of the things that struck me about the New Orleans selection, here's an opportunity for the league to achieve something that it's arguably struggled with: parity. Does that excite you?
But parity excites me, but what I always say, it's parity of opportunity. And just in the same way the draft works, where in essence doesn't matter what the market size is or where it's located. When the draft lottery, the ping pong balls come out, in that case it was New Orleans, but you want every team to have an opportunity to compete. And what we're seeing now in the league, especially with the advent of explosion of social media and digital media, that a player can be world renowned regardless of the market he's in, regardless of the size of that market. I mean, take Giannis Antetokounmpo, for example. In Milwaukee, he was the #1 vote getter in the East for All-Star. And so clearly that demonstrates that it's not about the market size. Or obviously LeBron, when he was in Cleveland, that certainly was an impediment to global fame. And that's what you want in the league. You want players to see that it's ultimately about winning. It's ultimately about the culture of that franchise. It's not about the size of the market or the perceived attractiveness of it. But that's what we want, is a 30-team league.
Zion's ascent this season also sparked a conversation again about eligibility. I know recently you sort of changed your mind on eligibility rules. You have said that you would be fine with players going straight from high school to the NBA. What changed your mind on eligibility?
I'd say the last straw was the commission that was assembled by the NCAA, led by former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. I spent a significant amount of time with her talking about these issues, and she ultimately concluded with her task force that these young players would be better off coming directly to the NBA. And we're only talking about a select few, that cohort of those so-called one-and-done players. And I think it's a close call. If you asked a lot of our general managers who have to ultimately put themselves on the line in making these draft picks, if they'd rather have seen a player play in college before they need to make that draft decision, they would say, I'd rather see him play for 3 years before I have to make that decision. But trying to balance out the issues, our opportunity to bring that player directly into the league, to start developing them in the NBA style. It also, because it changes eligibility issues, for example, now when Zion was in high school, we didn't have access to him because it would cost him his eligibility. If we know that cohort of the top players are coming directly into the NBA, we, our Players Association, USA Basketball, can start working with that group of elite players essentially when they're 14 and begin preparing them for lives as professionals.
What are the benefits for the league?
Well, first of all, for the league, the benefit is the training of those players. That, think about it in any of our lives, that period, 17, 18, 19, those are critically important development years. And face it, we know these top players are coming into the NBA. It's hard to predict how successful they'll actually be. That's why I'm reluctant to sort of declare Zion as LeBron. But we know that he's going to be a top draft pick when he's essentially 15 or 16 years old. So that the benefit to us is we can start working directly with those players, both in terms of game development, but probably more importantly, in terms of lifestyle development. I mean, think about that dramatic change in their lives when, I mean, it happened to Zion at Duke. In some ways it happened in high school these days because these players already have large social media followings. But it's an opportunity for us to start hands-on development of these players and sort of, one, from a skill standpoint, preparing them for our game, but also from a lifestyle standpoint.
How much of it also is about limiting the time in which they could be corrupted?
You know, it's actually a great question, and I think it does limit that time because there's a broken market right now. Clearly, these players have more value to these colleges than the scholarship itself. I mean, that's what an economist would say leads to the enormous corruption around some of these top players because they are so valuable to those schools. And it leads to people who not following the NCAA rules and even potentially criminal behavior, which we just saw in some of those recent court cases. So we can get to these players when they're younger. There can be complete transparency around what their NBA opportunity is. I mean, for example, there are some players, somebody's whispering to them, you're going to be a lottery pick when the consensus from the experts is no chance. Maybe that player will develop through college and when he's older and to be a great player. But I think this way we can share with the players sort of consensus best information. There can be real transparency around it. There's no incentive there for illegal behavior because we're going to be drafting them directly into the NBA.
You think college players should be paid?
It's such a tough question. I mean, they provide enormous value to certain schools. I think the problem is, from a practical standpoint, where do you begin? Take the Duke team, for example. Does every player make the same? Do you make different salaries for different players? There's Title IX, of course, in college. Does the women's team make the same?
But the rules could be changed. I mean,
I'm saying you could, but I don't. I guess my point is, I don't think they could easily be changed. It's one of the reasons why I think we're better off taking these players directly into the NBA. I mean, then of course you have the non-revenue sports at schools. I'm just not. I don't see an easy way that you could come up with a system where you're paying college players. Maybe you could give them rights to their likenesses, things like that, marketing rights around it, but direct salaries, I just don't see a framework that would work.
You led me to my next point. Does it strike you at all as perhaps unfair that guys like Zion Williamson can go into an arena and see thousands of people wearing his jersey, but not make a dime off that?
The concept of fairness there, I think, is difficult to legislate. I think because you have to look at the whole system. Yes, if you take that one player, that one superstar college player who's drawing enormous attention to his school, to his team, to NCAA basketball, there seems to be unfairness. When you look at the system in totality, and you have thousands of Division I scholarships, for example, and a whole system that supports them, I'm a little reluctant just to say that one aspect is unfair. I think the better solution, as Condoleezza Rice pointed out, is for this top cohort of players not to be part of the college system.
Let's talk about mental health in the league right now. We had Kevin Love on the show recently, and he has really sort of become the face of this issue, not just for the NBA, but perhaps in America, for men especially.
Well, I watched your feature with Kevin Love, and of course I know him well and talked to him a lot about this. I think he was experiencing something that he said he was uncertain what was happening to himself. I mean, I think, as he said, he went in the locker room, he was trying to literally pull something out of his mouth. Yeah. He was gasping for breath. I mean, certainly there are great physicians, trainers around the team, and in that case he got, immediate attention at the Cleveland Clinic. In fact, I think Kevin says he's one of the lucky ones because he has access to such fantastic health care. So I don't think it was, I think it was less about the lack of great health care. I think it's more the stigma, frankly, that has historically been around mental health issues in society, but certainly for these supposedly macho NBA players, that they have been reluctant to say, Coach, the stress is getting to me, or I'm nervous, or I can't sleep well because of all the focus on me. And I think what Kevin has done, both by getting help for himself, but then his willingness to be public about it, has helped to destigmatize it. And I know that in our youth programs, for example, it's become a core tenet. It used to be first just about basketball, then physical fitness, but now about mental health as well, where we have coaches and other administrators saying to these young people, boys and girls, do you ever have this sense that you can't really breathe, this sense that things are spinning out of control? Do you struggle with certain life issues? And if you do, come talk to us. And I think, and what I've pointed out to people, I mean, Kevin is remarkable in that he chose to be public about it. Yeah. But in the first instance, it's not about being public about it, of course. It's about those young people or NBA players seeking help. And again, Kevin's point is get help. It's not that you need to be public about it as well. So I think what Kevin has done, and DeMar DeRozan also decided to become public about his depression and anxiety, has caused a sea change, certainly in the NBA and I think in all professional sports, because it's allowed players to be comfortable speaking out about critically important issues.
I read something that you also said recently, and it caught my attention. You said that basically you thought anxiety in the NBA was far more widespread than perhaps a lot of folks realized. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are so many NBA players who are struggling with this?
A little, I should say my dad is a little bit anecdotal, and it comes from being in the league 27 years and talking to a lot of players all the time. And what I found, especially in the last few years, more players are privately telling me that they're dealing with issues of anxiety and stress in a more pronounced way than I recall historically. I think part of it, it's the same that we're seeing in their same age cohort, that I believe a lot of it is due to the advent enormous amount of social media. The same thing that may be so positive from a marketing standpoint in certain ways for the league, there's a lot of negative implications around it. And I think a lot of it correlates directly to screen time. I mean, for example, one of the tales I tell is that in the old days in the NBA, when you go into a locker room, music would be blaring. Guys would be socializing a lot more. When you go into an NBA locker room now, there's hardly ever music that's playing throughout the locker room because guys have headphones on. Guys are listening to their own music, they're a bit in their own world. And even when you get on the bus with the players or you get on a plane, they go right to their screens. And whether that's a tablet or whether that's a phone, they've increasingly isolated themselves. And I'll also say, this goes a little bit to the stigma issue too. A lot of people think of these macho players that they can take it when people are screaming at them, or on social media, the haters are out there criticizing them, their looks, the way they go about things. It affects them. They're just like everybody else. And so I think what we're seeing among these sort of millennials is that the downside of social media, and what we're working on therefore with our teams is to sort of bring some of that old-fashioned camaraderie back. And a lot of it is even like the physical touches in players. And you can see how isolating a life of an NBA player can be, because there is enormous stress. And if it gets further isolated by them sort of being in their own heads, and they're on social media, people they have no connection to are criticizing them, and then even when they're with their teammates, they're sort of alone with a group of people, you can see where that can cause problems. So I think there are ways to address it, but my comment was we are seeing a higher incidence of it in the league than we have historically.
Let's talk about something that the NBA has perhaps become known for more than some of its other counterparts here in recent years. Social activism. A number of players over the last few years especially have openly expressed political views. They've talked about whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality. They've talked about things that are important to them openly. There have been protests, and you haven't restricted it. You haven't punished these players. Why not?
First, I'd say there's a history of activism in this league, going back certainly to Bill Russell and that generation of players. I mean, what I've pointed out even to some of our young players, and Bill Russell, of course, comes to games still. Our MVP of the Finals trophy is named after him. That Bill Russell stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when Martin Luther King, of course, delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. And while today maybe we look back, or the young players would think that doesn't seem all that controversial, Bill Russell, as a result of his political activism, suffered enormous hate and violence to his home and his person. I mean, there were real ramifications back then for speaking out on those issues. And whether it's Oscar Robertson, who spoke out about important issues, Bob Cousy, there's a whole generation of players. I mean, then go up to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So there's a history in this league. I always tell our players it's part of the DNA of this league. It's nothing that I've put in place as a new policy, and certainly under David Stern. Again, I think players spoke out about important issues. What's changed, I think, is they now have a platform to go directly to people globally to talk about issues that are important to them, and that's social media. And essentially what we've said to our players, there's still guardrails, I would say. I mean, that at the end of the day, the standard to us is not that different than if you were interviewing one of our players or media were in a locker room. We are a business. We want players to speak to people respectfully. We talk to them about the difference between the substance of what they're saying, their view on important issues, as opposed to the language they use. I mean, we don't police every tweet that's out there, but I think within sort of those guardrails, we're proud of the fact that our players demonstrate to people, frankly, globally, that they're multidimensional, that they're not just ball players. They have views about the society around them, and it's not all political. Many of them use social media to talk about the music they love, or the restaurants they go to. But to us, at the end of the day, it's demonstrating that these are real people. And same on what Kevin Love, the way he and DeMar DeRozan have used this platform to talk about mental wellness. And Kevin even said to me, he said, but for that sense in the league that you're safe to speak out on important issues, he said, I'm not sure I would have chosen to be as public as I have been.
When a player criticizes the president, though, or a team refuses to go to the White House, does that make Adam Silver's job Any more difficult?
Sometimes. I mean, of course, I mean, we try to have broad-based appeal, but also what I've pointed out to people who have said to me, how can a player criticize the president? I've always said, this is America. You know, and if done respectfully, if a player chooses to say I don't support that president or the particular policies of that president, that makes the player hopefully just like every other American. I mean, in terms of going to the White House, I mean, I actually have encouraged teams to go to the White House. I've tried to depoliticize it, but ultimately have said to those teams that that's a team decision and you should make that decision as a team, and they have.
Why encourage a team to go?
You know, I'd say initially, when the president took office, I saw it as an opportunity. I saw it, maybe naively, as an opportunity for the president as well, to say, here's a group of young men who have a point of view and might be helpful to you and to those players to do something maybe outside the bright lights of the media, even if it were 15 minutes to have a conversation. And I'm sure the president would say, being misconstrued, you know, in many ways by the public, and the players would say, well, this is how you're affecting us and our families and our communities. And so I think talking in that dialogue is actually a helpful thing and should be encouraged.
Are you going to encourage this year's champion to go?
As I said, at this point, it's clearly a team decision. I think the times have changed, and I think that I would encourage them to think seriously about going.
Let's talk about women in the NBA. You have said that you want to see 50% of new referee hires in the next few years. You want those to be women. Is that a realistic expectation?
Well, what I've said was, in terms of what I can control, and that is the hiring of referees, that our goal is that for 50% of new referees to be women, to the extent that the pool is there, and I think the opportunity does exist. I mean, what I've said is that it makes no sense when you look back at the history of the league, considering all the progressive things we've done, how is it that we ended up with almost an exclusively male group of referees when there's not a physical attribute that's required that requires you to be a man to be a referee. And so we've begun that program over the last few years. 2 of the last 5 referees we've just hired are women, and so that's happening, and it's something I have more control. But what we've said is, and we're seeing that already, we have 7 assistant coaches now in the league who are women. But I'd make the same point generally to society, that there's absolutely no reason women shouldn't be coaching men. I don't want to set a quota there but realistically we know we're not going to hit in the short term. But I mean, take Becky Hammond, for example, with San Antonio. I mean, now she's moved to the front bench assistant coach. She's been interviewed for other jobs around the league. I don't have any doubt that Becky can coach. It's also, though, you've got to work your way up in the system. Most great coaches have been assistants for many years, sort of learn various, systems in order before they become in. But I think as a goal over time, you'd like to believe that you could have real equality there, and that over time it should be 50%.
It sounds like you think it's just a matter of time before we have a woman who's a head coach of an NBA team.
It's absolutely just a matter of time.
Let's talk about one woman in particular, Mystics player Cristie Tolliver. She became the first WNBA player who's an assistant coach, as I understand it. My understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, she makes about $10,000 as an assistant coach. When you've got other assistant coaches in the league who are making $100,000, in some cases close to $1 million, how do you explain that disparity?
It's actually a longer story. It's a WNBA collective bargaining issue. For example, Cristie could go be an assistant coach for any other team and make a market salary. The issue is in a league where you have a salary cap.
Okay.
She chose to be an assistant coach for the Wizards, of course, the counterpart to the Mystics in Washington, D.C. So the issue is there are many WNBA teams that don't have an NBA counterpart. So if you have a salary cap system, if you're a team that doesn't, if you're a WNBA team that isn't also operated by a group that controls an NBA team, you would be at a competitive disadvantage. Or you could say, come play for our team, and we know we can only pay you this much under the salary cap, but you can also be an assistant coach on the NBA side. So I'd only say that, I mean, for example, Sue Bird is an assistant coach with the Denver Nuggets, also a star player in the WNBA. We have no idea what she's making. It's not our business because she's not an assistant coach for the same organization that she plays for.
So there's not a pay disparity issue in the NBA?
Well, I wouldn't say there's not a pay disparity issue. I mean, that's a whole separate issue. I think that that has been raised by WNBA players in terms of what they make on the floor. There's enormous disparity between what WNBA players make and NBA players make. I think, as you know, we just brought in a brand new commissioner of the WNBA, Kathy Engelbert, and who has a great track record as a highly successful businesswoman. And ultimately, though, there's a market economy. I think what we need to do on the WNBA side is grow that business so that we can pay WNBA players far more than they're currently making.
Let's talk about the game itself for a few moments while I have you here. Ratings, as I understand it, for the playoffs down close to 10% year over year. Why do you think that is? Why do you think you have fewer people watching the basketball playoffs?
I think it was mainly in the early round. I mean, face it, LeBron is one of the biggest stars in the world, and he also played in the East. And so, the reason I look a little bit tired is a lot of our games are in the West, and it's late at night, and I recognize most people choose to go to sleep at a reasonable time. And so from a rating standpoint, not having LeBron in the playoffs, not having him in the East has clearly impacted ratings. But I'd say generally, ratings have been great. I mean, they're up now as we're into the conference finals. The competition has been fantastic. I mean, it is something over time, though. A lot of young people who are core fans, I'm sure you see this in your business too, aren't necessarily subscribing to cable and satellite the way they did historically. So that's something we're very focused on. But we have enormous confidence in our product.
I've never really thought about it, but you raise an interesting larger point here. This West Coast dominance that we've seen in the league over the past few years. Maybe it's not necessarily that good for business.
It's not bad for business.
Yeah.
I'd only say, I think sometimes I forget 50% of television households in this country are in the Eastern time zone. And so if your West Coast games start at 10:30 at night in the East, you're invariably going to lose a lot of viewers who are around 11:30. I mean, you can just chart it. You see how many television households turn off, around 11:15, 11:30 at night, just because people have to get up for work in the morning. I mean, it is something we can address. We're talking about it. I mean, it would obviously be less convenient to those fans on the West Coast if we played even earlier. I mean, even just think about people getting to those arenas after work. If you start a game at 6 p.m. local time in the West, it's not the most convenient thing. It's not that as convenient for a television watcher on the West Coast either. But when you look at the league from a national standpoint, it may make sense to play a little bit earlier in the West, and that's something we're going to talk to our teams about this summer.
Are the games too long? Is the season too long?
I don't think the games are too long. Our games are about 2 hours and 15 minutes. And what we're seeing now in all our research, it's actually less about the overall length of the game than it is about pace. And I think the pace of our games are terrific. And in fact, 2 years ago, we shortened the time outs. We reduced the number of commercials in our games, and I think that helped improve the pace. There's probably some additional things we can do as well. In terms of the length of the season, I don't necessarily think that a season that runs from mid-October to mid-June when the finals end is too long. It may be the case that we have to format it in a different way. For example, I've talked a lot about this in international soccer. They play for other things. In the NBA, you have a long season. It's all about one trophy, that Larry O'Brien trophy at the end of the year. I mean, for example, maybe we should have a MidSeason Tournament where all the teams are competing. Maybe we should have a play-in tournament for the playoffs of those teams that are just on the outside of that bubble. I think other things that could create more excitement around the season other than just playing for one thing.
So you would have this tournament in the middle of the season. What would they be playing for?
Well, I've not so jokingly said the David Stern Cup of
I'm sure or the Adam Silver Cup.
No.
Obviously, the league is currently, as I understand it, the league is investigating Luke Walton and the allegations against him. What's the latest in that investigation?
It's ongoing. I mean, of course, not just any league, but any business this day and age. If there's an allegation against one of your employees, you're going to investigate. But I'd say at the same time, we've got to make sure that we protect the rights of the person who's accused as well. So that's our job, to be even-handed and fair. And it wouldn't be fair, of course, to Luke if I were to say something public about it. But we're looking into it.
I didn't ask you about replay. As perhaps you've heard, a number of fans, coaches, and players they've been somewhat critical of refereeing in the NBA here over the last year or so, in part because of the camera angles that we have now, the access, and the technology. How do you fix that?
Maybe through even more technology. The ultimate goal is to get it right, and we try to strike the right balance between the flow of the game, which I talked about earlier, and stoppage that comes from replay. And that's why we use replay in certain limited situations now. Maybe there's a few other times, like the NFL just made an adjustment in terms of when they are going to use replay going forward. So it's something we're constantly looking at. Maybe we can, through better technology, speed it up. For example, it looks a little antiquated now. The game stops, the officials walk over to courtside, they put on headphones, they turn the monitor around. I think plenty of people said to me, 2019 must be better technology. So we're looking at earpieces for the officials, although that gets complicated because they need to hear what's happening on the floor at the same time. So we can get it better, but I'd say I think as the playoffs have gone on, it's actually gotten much better. I think the perception of the officiating, the relationship between the officials and the players, you know, when in 50 years from now, when the commissioner is then being interviewed by you, who'll still be around doing your job, you know, who knows, but we'll still be talking about refereeing. But I actually think people don't realize how good our referees are. It's an incredibly strong program. The training is absolute best in the world. They're scrutinized in every possible way. Only the best officials advance round to round throughout the playoffs. So the officiating has been a non-story in the last few rounds, which is exactly what we want.
Who do you want to see in the finals?
Great refereeing.
You're not going to say it, huh? But last question here. The Golden State Warriors, I mean, if they win again, it's 3 out of 4. Is that good for the game when a team is so dominant?
Great competition is good for the game.
But does it make it boring? Does it make it predictable?
That certainly doesn't make it boring to me. And as I've watched the games over the last few weeks, including some incredibly close games involving the Warriors, I think it's been some of the most exciting basketball. And I think, you know, look in other sports, you know, whether it's the Patriots, whether it's Tiger Woods in his prime. I mean, people want to see great competition. They want to make sure it's fair, you know, and they want to make sure that the best team wins. I understand that. But I think other than that, you know, I have to step back as commissioner and let it play out. And, you know, may the best team win.